The most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing dignity has a uniform. The first thing people noticed was not the flashing patrol lights or the gathering crowd outside the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. It was the silence of the man standing on the granite steps. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with a neatly folded pocket square, he held a worn leather briefcase in one hand and looked toward the towering columns as though he had walked that path 1,000 times before. His posture was calm, his expression composed, and there was nothing about him that suggested panic. Yet to Officer Ethan Walker, a white police officer beginning what he believed would be another ordinary morning, the man seemed out of place the instant he saw him. Bias often arrives quietly, dressed as certainty, and by the time reason has a chance to speak, assumptions have already reached their verdict. Ethan stepped out of his cruiser, adjusted the badge on his chest, and crossed the sidewalk with deliberate confidence. Around them, attorneys hurried through security, clerks balanced stacks of legal files, reporters checked their cameras, and visitors climbed the courthouse stairs beneath a cloudless spring sky. The city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware that within minutes one decision would leave an entire institution holding its breath. "Sir," Ethan called firmly, "I need you to stop for a moment." The man immediately complied. He turned with measured grace, maintaining steady eye contact without the slightest hint of resistance. "Good morning, officer," he replied. "How may I help you?" His voice carried neither fear nor irritation. It was calm enough to unsettle anyone expecting an argument. Ethan glanced over the briefcase, the polished shoes, the courthouse entrance only a few yards away, then back at the stranger's face. Something about that confidence irritated him. "Identification," Ethan said. The man reached slowly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. "Certainly." Before the wallet was fully visible, Ethan interrupted. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Several pedestrians slowed their pace. 2 tourists paused near the courthouse fountain, lifting their phones with the casual curiosity that public confrontations often attract. The stranger simply lowered his hand again. "Of course," he answered. "Officer, if you'll allow me to explain where I'm going, this misunderstanding can end right here." Ethan barely listened. He had already convinced himself that the explanation would be another excuse. "You can explain later," he replied. "Right now you're being detained while I verify your identity." A faint murmur spread across the small crowd. Some people exchanged uncertain glances, while others watched in complete silence, unwilling to interfere. The man never raised his voice. He never argued. Instead, he looked directly at Ethan with an expression that was impossible to read, almost as if he were observing a lesson unfold rather than becoming its subject. "Officer," he said quietly, "every decision we make has consequences. Please make sure yours follows the law." Ethan interpreted the words as arrogance instead of caution. Without hesitation, he informed the man that he was under arrest pending further investigation. The briefcase was carefully set on the courthouse steps. The stranger offered no resistance as standard handcuffs were placed on his wrists according to procedure. He neither protested nor pleaded. His composure only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Nearby, one courthouse employee suddenly stopped walking and stared. Another reached for a phone with unexpected urgency. Inside the building, a security supervisor frowned at an empty hallway before looking toward the main entrance. Somewhere beyond the courthouse doors, a meeting scheduled to begin precisely at 9 o'clock remained delayed by a single unexplained absence. Outside, however, Officer Ethan Walker believed he had complete control of the situation. He had no idea that every passing second was carrying him closer to the one name that would change the meaning of that morning forever. The ride to the precinct lasted less than 10 minutes, yet it felt strangely disconnected from the noise of the city outside. Traffic flowed through downtown Washington without interruption, office workers filled the sidewalks with coffee cups in hand, and tourists admired monuments that had witnessed generations of American history. Inside the patrol vehicle, however, silence settled between Officer Ethan Walker and the man seated behind him. The stranger remained composed, looking through the window with quiet attention, as though every familiar building carried memories that only he understood. He did not complain about the handcuffs. He did not demand special treatment. He simply observed the streets passing by with the same calm expression he had worn outside the courthouse. Ethan checked the rearview mirror several times, almost hoping to catch a glimpse of anxiety, frustration, or anger. Instead, he found steady eyes and remarkable patience. It unsettled him more than any argument could have. Most people protested. Most people defended themselves. This man did neither. When they arrived at the station, several officers looked up from their desks with casual curiosity. One officer quietly asked, "What happened?" Ethan answered with confidence. "Possible security concern near the federal courthouse. I am verifying his identity." Nobody questioned the explanation. Procedures continued as usual. The stranger was escorted into an interview room where the fluorescent lights cast soft reflections across the polished table. Ethan removed a small notebook from his pocket and took a seat across from him. "State your full name," he said. The man smiled politely. "I will gladly identify myself. I only ask that you allow me to present my credentials before making additional assumptions." Ethan folded his arms. "I am asking the questions." The response that followed was measured, almost gentle. "And I will answer every lawful question you ask." Once again, there was no hostility. There was only dignity. Outside the room, routine conversations slowly became interrupted by unexpected phone calls. A courthouse administrator contacted the station asking whether anyone had encountered a distinguished visitor who had failed to arrive for a scheduled proceeding. The desk sergeant took the message without much concern, assuming someone had simply been delayed by traffic. A few minutes later another call arrived, this time from the office of the United States Marshals. The tone sounded more urgent, but the details remained limited. Meanwhile, Ethan continued reviewing paperwork. "Do you understand why you were detained?" he asked. "I understand why you believed you had a reason," the man replied. "Those are not always the same thing." Ethan frowned. "You seem unusually calm." The man nodded slightly. "Experience teaches that panic rarely reveals the truth. Patience often does." The words lingered in the room long after they were spoken. Ethan dismissed them as rehearsed confidence, yet something about them refused to leave his thoughts. Through the narrow window in the interview room door, another officer glanced inside before quickly walking away to answer a ringing telephone. The atmosphere throughout the station had begun to shift. Conversations became quieter. Footsteps moved faster across the hallway. Computer screens displayed incoming notifications that seemed unrelated at first glance but shared one common detail. Somewhere inside the federal courthouse, an important session remained delayed because one essential person had not arrived. No announcement had been made. No names had been released. Yet every passing minute increased the urgency behind closed doors while the man sitting quietly across the table never once asked to leave. He simply rested his hands on the table, looked at the clock, and waited with the unmistakable confidence of someone who already knew that the truth never needed to hurry because eventually the truth always arrived exactly on time. Officer Ethan Walker had always believed that confidence was one of the most valuable qualities a police officer could possess. Hesitation could cost precious seconds. Doubt could cloud judgment. Throughout his career he had been praised for acting decisively, and over time that praise had quietly transformed into something far more dangerous. He no longer questioned whether his first impression might be wrong. To him, instinct had become evidence. Sitting outside the interview room, he completed another page of paperwork with the steady rhythm of someone convinced the day was unfolding exactly as it should. His supervisor walked past and glanced toward the closed door. "Everything under control?" he asked. Ethan nodded without looking up. "Routine identity verification." The supervisor accepted the answer and continued down the hallway, unaware that the station had begun receiving a growing number of inquiries from federal offices across the city. Ethan noticed officers speaking more quietly than usual near the communications desk. Phones continued ringing. Computer notifications appeared one after another. Still, none of it seemed connected to the quiet man waiting only a few feet away. Ethan leaned back in his chair and replayed the encounter outside the courthouse in his mind. The tailored suit. The polished shoes. The calm voice. To Ethan, those details had not suggested authority. They had suggested confidence beyond one's place. He remembered the steady eye contact and interpreted it as defiance rather than composure. Every observation reinforced the conclusion he had already chosen to believe. Confirmation felt comfortable because it required no self-examination. Inside the interview room, Marcus Ellison remained exactly as he had been since arriving. He sat upright with remarkable patience, occasionally glancing toward the clock on the wall before returning his attention to the quiet room. He neither complained about the delay nor asked how much longer the process would take. His calm presence seemed almost unaffected by the uncertainty surrounding him. A younger officer carrying a folder paused outside the window and looked inside. "He has been sitting there the whole time," she quietly asked another deputy. "Has not said much," came the reply. "Just keeps waiting." The young officer frowned for a moment before continuing down the hall. Something about the man's quiet confidence lingered in her thoughts, although she could not explain why. Ethan eventually stepped back into the room carrying another form. "This would move much faster if you simply answered every question directly," he said. Marcus offered a courteous smile. "I have answered every lawful question directly." Ethan placed the paperwork on the table. "You seem very certain that everything will work out." Marcus looked toward the courthouse visible through the distant station window before answering. "Truth does not become less true because someone refuses to recognize it." The words landed softly, yet they filled the room with unexpected weight. Ethan chose not to respond. Instead, he stood and walked back toward the hallway where the atmosphere had changed once again. The communications supervisor was now speaking with visible urgency while another dispatcher searched through official directories. A federal courthouse clerk had called again. This time the request was no longer casual. An entire proceeding involving multiple senior officials remained delayed because one essential participant had disappeared without explanation. No one outside that courthouse seemed to know where he had gone. Ethan glanced toward the interview room one more time before returning to his paperwork, still convinced that he was preventing a problem rather than creating one. He did not realize that with every passing minute, the distance between certainty and truth was becoming smaller, and soon the name of the quiet man behind that closed door would force everyone in the building to reconsider what authority truly looked like. The station no longer sounded like an ordinary weekday morning. Ringing telephones overlapped with hurried conversations, printers released page after page of official notices, and footsteps echoed through the corridors with growing urgency. Yet inside the interview room, none of that noise seemed capable of disturbing Marcus Ellison. He remained seated with quiet patience, his hands resting comfortably on the table, his attention occasionally drifting toward the wall clock as its second hand continued its steady journey around the dial. Time never appeared to pressure him. It only seemed to pressure everyone else. Officer Ethan Walker noticed the change in atmosphere but refused to connect it to the man he had detained. Instead, he convinced himself that federal buildings always operated under unusual circumstances. Washington was filled with officials, agencies, and unexpected interruptions. Whatever was happening elsewhere in the city surely had nothing to do with the quiet stranger sitting only a few yards away. As Ethan organized another stack of documents, a dispatcher hurried past carrying a printed message. "The courthouse called again," she said to the desk sergeant. "They are asking if anyone matching a specific description has been brought into custody this morning." The sergeant frowned. "Did they say why?" "No. Only that the matter is extremely urgent." Before either man could continue the conversation, another telephone rang. This time the caller identified the office of the United States Marshals. The dispatcher listened carefully, her expression changing with every passing sentence. She wrote several notes before quietly handing them to the sergeant, who read them twice without saying a word. Ethan glanced toward them but returned to his paperwork without asking questions. Confidence often discourages curiosity. He believed there would eventually be a reasonable explanation that confirmed his decision. Inside the interview room, Marcus finally spoke after several quiet minutes. "Officer Walker." Ethan looked up. "Yes? May I ask what time it is?" Ethan checked his watch. 9:23. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you." That was all he said. No complaint. No request. Only gratitude. The simplicity of the exchange somehow made Ethan even more uncomfortable. Most people in similar situations demanded answers. This man only gathered information, as though each passing minute confirmed something he already understood. Outside, another patrol officer entered the station carrying coffee before stopping abruptly at the front desk. "What is going on?" he asked. "Everybody looks nervous." The sergeant lowered his voice. "Apparently an important federal proceeding has not started because one key official never arrived. Multiple agencies are looking for him." "Who is it?" the patrol officer asked. The sergeant slowly shook his head. "They have not released the name." At that exact moment, a pair of dark government vehicles quietly turned onto the street outside the station. Their arrival attracted little attention from pedestrians, but several officers near the front windows exchanged puzzled looks. The vehicles remained parked with their engines idling as though their occupants were waiting for confirmation before stepping outside. Ethan followed their gaze through the glass but dismissed the sight almost immediately. Government vehicles were common throughout the capital. Nothing about them seemed remarkable. Meanwhile, Marcus sat exactly where he had been since arriving, his expression unchanged. He closed his eyes for only a brief moment before opening them again with the same quiet composure. It was not the expression of someone hoping to be rescued. It was the expression of someone who trusted that truth required no performance. Somewhere beyond the station walls, telephones continued ringing across government offices throughout Washington. Somewhere inside the courthouse, judges, attorneys, and court staff remained standing by in unusual silence. And inside one modest interview room, the man everyone was searching for waited without announcing who he was, allowing every assumption already made about him to reveal far more about others than it ever could about him. Across Washington, the morning schedule had quietly begun to unravel in ways that few people could understand. Inside the federal courthouse, clerks moved between courtrooms carrying updated calendars that no longer matched reality. Attorneys checked their watches with growing concern. Court officers exchanged confused glances as another scheduled announcement was postponed without explanation. No one raised their voice. Institutions built on discipline rarely did. Yet beneath the calm surface, urgency spread from one office to another with remarkable speed. In a secured conference room overlooking the courthouse plaza, several senior officials remained seated around a polished oak table where an unopened case file rested in the center. Every document had been prepared. Every legal team had arrived. Every security protocol had been completed before sunrise. Only one chair remained empty. A court administrator quietly entered the room carrying a tablet. "We still have not located him," she reported. The room fell silent. One official slowly removed his glasses and asked, "Has every scheduled route been checked?" "Yes." "His office?" "Already confirmed." "The courthouse entrance?" "Security cameras show that he arrived near the building, but after that the record becomes unclear." No one spoke for several seconds. Finally another official said, "We cannot begin without him." Back at the police station, none of those conversations were visible, yet their consequences were beginning to arrive one telephone call at a time. The communications desk received another request from federal authorities asking whether any unidentified professional matching a detailed description had recently been detained. The request was polite, but the wording carried unmistakable urgency. The desk sergeant carefully reread every line before looking toward the interview room. He hesitated for the first time that morning. Officer Ethan Walker noticed the glance but interpreted it as routine curiosity. He remained convinced that procedure was protecting the public rather than delaying something far more significant. Confidence continued to shield him from doubt. Inside the interview room, Marcus Ellison remained as composed as ever. He observed the quiet movement of sunlight across the table without showing the slightest frustration. After several peaceful moments, he looked toward Ethan and spoke with the same measured voice that had never once risen above conversation. "May I ask you something, officer?" Ethan nodded cautiously. "Go ahead. When you first saw me this morning, what convinced you that I did not belong where I was going?" The question lingered in the air. Ethan searched for an immediate answer but found none that sounded as certain as they had only an hour earlier. "You matched circumstances that concerned me," he finally replied. Marcus offered a respectful nod. Sometimes circumstances deserve investigation. Assumptions deserve the same. Ethan remained silent. Before he could respond, another telephone rang outside. This time the dispatcher stood immediately instead of remaining seated. She transferred the call directly to the station commander. Moments later the commander's office door closed. Through the glass panels overlooking the parking lot, several officers noticed that the dark government vehicles waiting outside had not left. Instead, another official vehicle quietly joined them. Men and women in professional attire stepped onto the sidewalk, speaking calmly into earpieces while scanning the entrance without creating unnecessary attention. No flashing lights appeared. No dramatic announcements interrupted the morning. Everything remained orderly, almost remarkably so. Yet the growing number of federal personnel waiting outside suggested that whatever had begun as a simple misunderstanding was rapidly becoming something far larger than anyone inside the station had imagined. And through it all, Marcus Ellison never attempted to reveal his position, never demanded recognition, and never asked anyone to believe him. He simply trusted that before long the truth would arrive at the front door on its own, carrying with it the answer every person in the building had been searching for without even realizing it. The front doors of the station opened with quiet precision rather than dramatic urgency. Every conversation in the lobby seemed to pause at once as four individuals entered wearing dark business suits, each displaying the unmistakable professionalism of people accustomed to carrying great responsibility without raising their voices. At their center walked Federal Marshal Sarah Coleman, her calm expression revealing neither frustration nor panic. She approached the front desk with measured confidence and placed an official credential on the counter. "Good morning," she said. "We are looking for a gentleman who was detained near the federal courthouse approximately 1 hour ago." The desk sergeant straightened immediately. "May I ask who you are looking for?" Sarah looked directly at him before answering. "Justice Marcus Ellison." The name settled over the room like complete silence. Several officers exchanged puzzled glances. The words sounded familiar, yet no one immediately understood why. Ethan Walker stepped forward from the hallway, carrying the same confidence that had guided every decision he had made that morning. "The individual is in one of our interview rooms," he said. "We are still verifying his identity." Sarah's expression remained respectful, but her eyes reflected unmistakable concern. "Officer, there is no further verification required." Ethan frowned. "Ma'am, with respect, procedure must be followed." Sarah nodded once. "I agree completely. Which is why I am asking you to review the credentials that were already available before any assumptions were made." She opened a secure folder and carefully removed several official documents. The station commander accepted them without speaking. His eyes moved across the first page, then quickly to the second. The color slowly faded from his face. He read every line again before lifting his head toward Ethan with an expression that no one in the room had ever seen before. "Open the interview room," he quietly instructed. Ethan hesitated for the first time all morning. "Sir?" "Now." The hallway suddenly felt much longer than before. Officers instinctively stepped aside as the commander, Sarah Coleman, and several federal officials approached the closed door. Ethan unlocked it and slowly pushed it open. Marcus Ellison looked up from the table with the same calm expression he had maintained since the beginning of the morning. He stood as the visitors entered. Before a single word was spoken, every federal official in the room acknowledged him with visible respect. Sarah offered a warm smile. "Good morning, Justice Ellison. We have been looking for you." Marcus returned the smile with quiet grace. "I suspected you eventually would." The station commander immediately addressed him. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus answered gently. "I appreciate your professionalism in addressing it. No anger. No accusation. Only composure." Ethan remained frozen near the doorway, unable to understand how every conversation had changed so completely in only a few seconds. Sarah then turned toward the officers gathered outside the room. "Allow me to formally introduce the individual you detained this morning. This is Justice Marcus Ellison, a sitting justice serving on the federal Supreme Court, scheduled to preside over one of the most significant constitutional proceedings of the year." A quiet gasp spread through the hallway. The courthouse official who had arrived moments earlier lowered his head respectfully. Even officers who had never met Marcus immediately recognized the extraordinary importance of the position being described. Ethan felt every assumption he had made that morning collapse under the weight of a single truth. The man he had judged by appearance had never needed to announce his title because genuine authority had never depended upon recognition. It had been present from the very beginning, quietly waiting for everyone else to see what dignity had already revealed. For several long seconds, no one inside the station moved. The hallway that had been filled with quiet conversations only moments earlier now carried a different kind of silence, one born from the realization that first impressions could reshape an entire morning for all the wrong reasons. Officer Ethan Walker remained near the doorway, unable to take his eyes off Justice Marcus Ellison. Every detail he had dismissed earlier suddenly returned with startling clarity. The measured voice. The calm posture. The complete absence of fear. None of those had been signs of arrogance. They had been signs of experience, discipline, and confidence earned over decades of service. The station commander slowly turned toward Ethan. His expression remained professional, but the disappointment was impossible to miss. "Officer Walker," he said quietly, "please surrender your case file to Internal Affairs for immediate review." Ethan nodded without argument. For the first time since putting on his uniform that morning, certainty had completely abandoned him. Across the station, officers who had casually observed the detention now looked at one another with uneasy expressions. Nobody celebrated what had happened. Nobody whispered accusations. Instead, an uncomfortable question settled over the room. If a man with unquestionable credentials could be misjudged so quickly, how many others had carried the weight of assumptions before anyone truly listened to them? Federal Marshal Sarah Coleman accepted a sealed envelope from another official and handed it to the station commander. "This is the formal notification requesting preservation of all reports, recordings, radio traffic, and security footage related to today's events," she explained. "The review will focus on procedure, documentation, and decision-making." The commander accepted the envelope immediately. "You have my full cooperation." Marcus observed the exchange without satisfaction or resentment. He understood that accountability achieved its greatest purpose when it strengthened institutions rather than weakened them. Ethan finally found the courage to speak. His voice sounded noticeably quieter than before. "Justice Ellison," he began, "I believed I was doing my job." Marcus met his eyes with remarkable kindness. "I believe you believed that." The answer was gentle, yet it carried more weight than any lecture could have delivered. Ethan lowered his gaze. Marcus continued. The difficult question is not whether you acted. The difficult question is what convinced you to act before you understood who was standing in front of you. No one interrupted. Even the routine sounds of the station seemed to fade into the background. The words were not spoken to embarrass anyone. They were spoken because reflection often begins where certainty ends. The station commander ordered that Marcus's belongings be returned immediately. The leather briefcase was placed carefully on the table exactly as it had been found. His identification and personal effects followed without delay. Marcus inspected nothing. He simply thanked the officers handling the property with the same courtesy he had shown throughout the morning. That quiet consistency affected several people more deeply than any expression of anger could have. Outside the station, reporters had begun gathering after hearing that an unexpected delay had interrupted a major federal proceeding. They knew something important had happened, but very few understood why. Inside, however, the real story had already taken shape. It was not about the title carried by one distinguished public servant. It was about the danger of allowing assumptions to speak louder than evidence. As Justice Marcus Ellison prepared to leave the interview room, he paused briefly beside Officer Ethan Walker. A badge represents responsibility, he said softly. Respect gives that responsibility its meaning. Ethan nodded slowly, knowing those words would remain with him far longer than any official report ever could. Justice Marcus Ellison stepped out of the interview room without haste, carrying the same leather briefcase that had rested untouched on the station table for most of the morning. Federal Marshal Sarah Coleman walked beside him while the station commander accompanied them toward the front entrance. Every officer they passed acknowledged him with quiet respect. There were no dramatic speeches, no celebration, and no public display of emotion. The greatest moments of dignity rarely required an audience. Outside, the waiting government vehicles remained in place beneath the bright Washington sky. Reporters had gathered behind the designated media area, their cameras pointed toward the station doors, hoping to understand why several federal agencies had converged on a local precinct. They called out questions as Marcus emerged, but he did not stop to speak. Sarah looked toward him. The press office can prepare a statement if you wish. Marcus smiled politely. The facts will speak clearly enough once the review is complete. His answer reflected the same principle that had guided him throughout his career. Public trust was strengthened by transparency, not by personal attention. Back inside the station, the command staff gathered in a conference room where the first steps of the administrative review were already underway. Every report written that morning was carefully collected. Body camera recordings, dispatch communications, security footage, and written timelines were preserved according to departmental policy. No one discussed punishment before evidence. No one reached conclusions before examining the full record. That discipline mattered because justice demanded consistency, even when the outcome seemed obvious. Officer Ethan Walker sat quietly at the far end of the table. For the first time in many years, he listened without preparing a response. He replayed every decision in his mind, recognizing how quickly assumptions had replaced observation. He remembered interrupting before credentials could be presented. He remembered interpreting calmness as defiance. Most of all, he remembered believing that confidence alone guaranteed accuracy. The station commander finally addressed everyone in the room. This review is not only about one encounter. It is about whether our decisions reflect the standards we have sworn to uphold every single day. Procedures exist to protect every person equally, and that principle begins with us. The room remained silent as those words settled over every officer present. Across the city, the delayed federal proceeding finally resumed after Justice Marcus Ellison arrived at the courthouse. Court personnel stood respectfully as he entered the courtroom, but nothing about his appearance suggested that he had experienced an extraordinary morning. He greeted the clerks by name, thanked the marshals for their professionalism, and took his place with the same quiet confidence that had never left him. Those watching would never have guessed that only a short time earlier he had been sitting inside a local police interview room waiting for truth to catch up with assumption. Before the hearing officially began, one court clerk quietly apologized for the unexpected delay. Marcus answered with gentle sincerity. Every institution is measured by how it responds after discovering a mistake. Today gives all of us an opportunity to become better. The clerk nodded thoughtfully. His words spread quietly through the courthouse over the next several hours, repeated not because they were dramatic, but because they reflected something larger than a single misunderstanding. They reminded everyone that the strongest systems were not the ones that never faced difficult moments. They were the ones willing to examine themselves honestly, correct their course, and ensure that respect, fairness, and equal treatment remained stronger than assumption every time the law was called upon to serve the people. Several weeks later, the events of that spring morning had already become part of conversations far beyond a single police station or courthouse. Training academies quietly incorporated the incident into professional discussions about judgment, procedure, and the responsibility that comes with public authority. Supervisors reminded new officers that every encounter begins long before a name is known or a title is discovered. Respect is not something earned by rank. It is something offered because every person deserves to be treated with fairness under the law. Officer Ethan Walker returned to duty only after completing the administrative process and additional professional training required by his department. The experience had changed him in ways no classroom ever could. He no longer believed that confidence alone made someone effective. Instead, he learned that humility often protected good judgment far better than certainty ever could. During one community meeting several months later, a young recruit asked him what the most important lesson of his career had been. Ethan paused before answering. "Never let your first assumption become your final conclusion," he said. "The moment you stop listening is the moment you stop serving." Those words surprised even him because they reflected a lesson he had once been unwilling to hear. Across the city, Justice Marcus Ellison continued his work with the same quiet dedication that had defined his entire career. He never mentioned the incident during public speeches, never sought interviews, and never attempted to turn one difficult morning into personal recognition. His focus remained exactly where it had always belonged, on the Constitution, the law, and the people those principles were meant to protect. When colleagues occasionally expressed sympathy for what had happened, Marcus responded with the same calm wisdom. "The goal is never to prove that one person was important," he would say. "The goal is to remember that every person is important before we know anything else about them." Those simple words gradually found their way into leadership seminars, legal conferences, and community forums because they spoke to something much larger than one misunderstanding. They reminded people that equality loses its meaning whenever appearance is allowed to outweigh character. One quiet afternoon, Ethan visited the courthouse for a public legal education event attended by students from local high schools. As the program concluded, he noticed Marcus speaking with several teenagers who had stayed behind to ask questions about public service. When the students finally left, Ethan approached him with genuine respect. "Justice Ellison," he said, "I wanted to thank you. You could have responded very differently that day." Marcus smiled warmly. "Every difficult moment gives us two choices," he replied. "We can build a wall, or we can build understanding. Institutions become stronger when people choose the second." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. There was nothing left to add. Some lessons required silence more than conversation. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the courthouse steps, people from every background walked through the same entrance, each carrying different stories, different responsibilities, and different hopes. None of them knew the quiet history that had unfolded there only weeks before. Perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Justice had never depended upon dramatic endings or public applause. It depended upon ordinary people making extraordinary choices one decision at a time. And maybe that is the lesson worth remembering long after every headline has faded. A badge can command attention, but only character earns trust. A title can inspire respect, but dignity requires no introduction. Because in the end, the strongest voice of justice is not the one that speaks the loudest. It is the one that refuses to see another human being through the narrow lens of assumption.